Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Concerns over inflation and recession are mounting. China-U.S. tensions are simmering. The war in Ukraine seems unlikely to end soon. So how will the global economy hold up in a year of chaos? And how are countries coping with the economic and geopolitical risks? To find out more, I'm joined by Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow of the Pelosi China Center of the Yale Law School. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, Stephen. Well, let's start with the latest. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan despite this strong opposition from China. Unofficially, we know that the White House, the Pentagon have made a little secret of their opposition to her visit. Why did Pelosi insist on making the trip to the island, against the advice of the White House?
Well, it's an unfortunate example of political theater that plays to bipartisan anti-China sentiment in the U.S. Congress as well as in the American public. And of course, it plays well to political sentiment in Taiwan as well. Unfortunately, this is a setback for an already conflicted U.S.-China relationship. So the visit, while it had political benefits for Speaker Pelosi in the very narrow sense, I think had strategic ramifications that go well beyond the political implications, and they are unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, this this political strategic ramifications, this probably will see further worsening, let's say, of the relationship between China and the U.S. Then in what way this, China-U.S. relations will somehow affect probably the global political and economic landscape?
Well, look, the U.S. and China are the two largest economies in the world, arguably the two most powerful nations in the world. And they have been on a path of escalating conflict for a number of years, but especially over the last 5 years as we've entered a trade war, a tech war, and now the early stages of a Cold War. And when conflict arises, the possibility of an accident grows. And I've just finished a book that will be published shortly called Accidental Conflict. And it describes the clash of false narratives between the United States and China that has led to a very delicate state in their relationship. And I'm very worried about it. When you have escalating conflict, the possibility of an accident getting out of hand becomes very real.
Mm-hmm. Speak of the economy, the U.S. GDP for the second quarter, we see there's a shrinking. If you follow the technical sense, technical or definition of a recession, people would call it traditionally like that's a recession. But obviously, White House disagrees with such a definition. They say there are other factors you need to take into consideration. So what's your take of the economic situation in the country?
Well, I think the debate is focused on, the wrong aspect of this information that you just alluded to in the second quarter. The U.S. is not in recession right now, but the data for the first 2 quarters of this year are decidedly weak, and they put the U.S. near the recession threshold. And in my opinion, they point to the likelihood of a further weakening ahead as the impacts of sharply higher U.S. interest rates in an effort to address inflation take their toll. So no, we're not in recession now, but we're most likely headed there later this year or in 2023.
Mm-hmm. So what are the factors you mean if we make a judgment on whether the recession is around the corner or not? Has it to do probably a lot to do with this interest rate increase by the Fed or continue the increase, let's say?
Well, there are a lot of factors that will affect the state of the U.S. economy. But when you are growing at a very low rate, you lack the resilience, the cushion to withstand a shock. And the biggest shock out there will be the lagged impacts of sharply higher U.S. interest rates. They don't have an impact immediately. They take time to work their way through the system, and we're just starting to see that. There's a lot of other possible shocks to worry about: the war in Ukraine, disruptions to supply chains, and the tensions arising between the United States and China over Taiwan. These are all possibilities. When the economy is growing weakly, it does not have the ability to withstand these types of shocks.
Stephen, you are the first economist, to warn, actually 2 years ago, about the comeback of stagflation. So tell us, first of all, what is a stagflation, and how worse it could be? Probably worse than inflation, right?
Well, we certainly had a very difficult period with stagflation in the late 70s. Stagflation is defined as slowing growth, rising unemployment, accompanied by persistent and high inflation. We have the inflation, we have the slowing growth. The unemployment rate has yet to rise. I suspect that it will over the next several quarters. And to the extent that inflation remains persistently above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, which I think is a strong possibility, then we could well be in another stagflationary period reminiscent of that which we saw in the 1970s. And that's a difficult phenomena for financial markets and for the economy and for other nations around the world.
So is there anything, I guess, policymakers can do to minimize the negative effects of stagflation? I know the priority right now for the Federal Reserve is to bring down the inflation, so the key interest rates increase, right?
Well, I think it's important to be disciplined and focused on addressing inflation, and we can see very clearly that there are two sources to this upsurge in inflation. One is coming from the supply side, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the disruptions to global supply chains. There are different actions that clearly must be associated with dealing with those sources of inflation. But then there's the excess demand side, which is also an outgrowth of the Federal Reserve's unusually and inappropriate stimulus in 2020 and 2021, together with massive fiscal stimulus. And those need to be addressed by more disciplined monetary tightening and reduction of federal sector budget deficits. And that's when politics come into play. And it's not always that easy to do the right thing. But if we don't counter the excess stimulus of monetary and fiscal policy, then we will fail to bring inflation and therefore stagflation under control.
Well, probably, you mentioned about 1970s. Probably today's situation is, I'm not sure, is that more challenging given, it's not only about the economic situation, it's also about the Ukraine war, it's about the supply chain, it's about the China-US tensions here. So it seems to me a lot more, factors complicating the situation here.
Well, no two periods are alike. I started my career as an economist for the Federal Reserve in the early 1970s. And we were faced with a very different set of circumstances, but circumstances that actually had an uncanny resemblance with, in many respects. There were a series of supply shocks. It started with the OPEC oil embargo following the war in Israel. And then we saw a lot of congestion. They weren't supply chains then, but simply global commodity markets that were disrupted by not just the oil embargo, but by pressures brought about from excessively stimulative monetary and fiscal policy that led to a synchronous boom in the world economy in the early 70s. The Federal Reserve dismissed those pressures as transitory, things that could not be addressed by monetary policy, and only belatedly discovered, as they have in the current period, that these were not transitory developments, that they needed to be addressed by a more forceful shift in monetary policy. It wasn't until Paul Volcker came to the Fed as the chairman in late 1979, many years later, that the Fed successfully addressed inflation. Jerome Powell was moving more quickly than was the case in the 1970s, and that's the good news. But the bad news is that he has, by waiting as long as he did, he has more to do, considerably more to do, to address inflation from the demand side.
Speak of this forceful monetary measures. The Fed said that they would announce a new round of increase of the interest rate, like by 75 percentage point there. This would be the second round of rate hike by 0.75%. So, what do you think of this rather aggressive or forceful moves taken by the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think it's entirely appropriate, and I would hope that they would stay on that trajectory to continue to boost interest rates by a significant amount through the end of this year. They have 3 more policy meetings this year, and they need to move, I think, by the same amount they did in the last 2 meetings. The goal, I think, of the Federal Reserve Board should be to bring the federal funds rate, their policy rate, in nominal terms, to or above the inflation rate. The inflation rate is likely to end this year well above the Fed's target of 2%. Could be as high as 5 or 6 or even 7% by the end of this year. We don't really know, but with the nominal federal funds rate right now only about 2.5 to 2.75%. There's obviously a long way to go to bring the inflation-adjusted federal funds rate back into a range that can contain this persistent and pervasive U.S. inflation.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of reducing the inflation. Obviously, the key part we had talked about, the Federal Reserve, that's their job to increase the interest rate. There's also talk of lifting some of the tariffs on imported Chinese goods. People would say that would be minimum, but still, that's better than nothing.
Well, I think the tariff policy was wrong from the start, and in my new book, Accidental Conflict, that is going to be released in a few months, I make the case that all of the tariffs should be reduced to pre-trade war levels. And if the U.S. were to do that and China were to reciprocate, that would be the equivalent of about a $65 billion tax cut for American consumers, and that would be constructive. The tariff rollbacks under consideration are small. They're only focused on some selected consumer products, at least so we are told, and they're likely to have a limited impact on U.S. inflation, and will not do much, if anything, to resolve the tension between the U.S. and China on the trade front.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's have a short break. We will come back and continue our discussion right after this. Welcome back. Okay, besides the Fed, we have the central banks in Australia, England, European countries. They are doing, taking similar moves by increasing the interest rate. How are the situations like in those countries, in those economies? Are they facing similar challenges like that in the U.S.?
Well, they are similar, but they're different in one respect. While their inflation rates have risen sharply, as is the case in the United States, their economies are weaker and therefore more vulnerable to recession than an otherwise more resilient U.S. economy. So the likelihood of recessions, and in the case of Europe, which is dealing with the likelihood of curtailment of the availability of Russian energy products, the recession risk is most acute. So the impacts of monetary tightening to address inflation are likely to be far more severe in most countries in Europe.
Most countries in Europe. What about the UK, for example? They are going to have a new prime minister, and the foreign policy or the economy is one of the important aspect, obviously, of the job of the new prime minister over there.
Well, the UK is more self-sufficient in energy than continental Europe, so they will benefit from that relative resilience on that front. But their inflation rate is sharply elevated, and the Bank of England has indicated that it is intent on also boosting interest rates aggressively to contain the outbreak of UK inflation. So the possibility of recession in the UK economy is very real as well.
Very real as well. Germany, for the largest economy on the European continent and also inside the European Union, besides the inflationary challenge, also there's energy crisis because of the Ukraine crisis, because of the relationship with Russia. They are trying to find alternative source of gas, for example. How do you see that kind of situation? How challenging is the situation for Germany and other European Union nations, let's say?
Well, Germany is particularly vulnerable because of the strong commitment that was made to Russian energy sources under the administration and chancellorship of Angela Merkel. In retrospect, that was an enormous strategic mistake. It left Germany far too dependent on a nation that has launched just an unfathomable war right now in Ukraine. And it also raises the possibility of, how long we can expect Germany to continue to resist the war efforts of Russia if its economy is put under such severe pressure by limited availability of natural gas and oil from Russia. Personally, I'm hopeful that Germany is willing to stay the course and to keep the Western alliance unified in addressing Vladimir Putin's aggression, but that remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen. As we said earlier, geopolitical factors sometimes also play a role here, obviously, like China, U.S., the competition, economic competition. The U.S. just passed this CHIPS Act to boost manufacturing of semiconductor chips in the United States. So what's the impact of this probably industry around the world, in other parts of the world? And will the U.S. be able to bring back the manufacturing in this sector?
I wish it were that easy, but we all know the importance of semiconductors in shaping global supply and their impact on virtually all aspects of goods that consumers buy and businesses utilize in their production of goods. So there's no more vital component in the world. America is was the leader in the development of semiconductors and is still the leader in the design of semiconductors, but is no longer the leader on the production side. And that certainly raises another aspect of the issues with respect to Taiwan. But you don't just push a button and give an industry $52 billion in subsidies and expect domestic capacity problems to be alleviated overnight. This is going to take a long period of time, and it smacks of overt efforts of U.S. industrial policy, precisely the issue that the United States has accused China of doing, and it's a real sort of hypocritical critique of America to be so strongly against nations who use industrial policies to support their industries, as China has been doing for years, and then to turn around and do the exact same thing ourselves. I think many of our semiconductor companies, especially Intel, the industry leader, has more than the wherewithal itself to rebuild capacity in America. It has just chosen not to do so because of cost disadvantages that it faces relative to foreign production platforms. And, I think this is less an issue of being able to address with government subsidies and more an issue of a domestic industry to figure out on its own terms rather than through the support of the United States taxpayer.
Mm-hmm. Well, one like a condition for companies which receive the subsidy from under the such act that they will not be allowed to do investment in China. So in that way, somehow the companies will face a dilemma, or are they going to somehow have to choose side?
Well, this is consistent with what has been called in some circles as friend shoring, where you locate offshore production not necessarily in the low-cost offshore platform, but in the platform of your of those nations who you are most friendly with. And to the extent that there is an ongoing trade war, tech war, and Cold War with China, that the U.S. Congress no longer views China as a friend. And so this CHIPS bill makes explicit consideration of that possibility. And, that's the prerogative of politicians to do that, but it certainly has an adverse impact on the efficiency results that would come from locating production in China or any other country that we choose to divert outsourcing away from.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Stephen, should China be concerned, about the U.S. efforts, I would say overall efforts to counter China in the global arms race, like in the tech sector, not only in chip production, but also in other tech sectors?
Well, look, I think we operate in a competitive world, and China is committed to investing and developing many advanced industries led by artificial intelligence. And China needs, as does the U.S., needs to focus on developing the best capabilities it can in its own economy and be less worried about the threats from others. Self-sufficiency is very important, and China is moving aggressively to develop its own self-sufficient semiconductor industry. And I think we'll be surprised at the progress that is made in China on that regard. But the threat of others only serves to motivate more efforts to be able to develop and produce new technologies on your own. And that's ultimately a good thing for all nations, including the United States and China.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of that, you published an article titled "Deglobalization is China Wild Card." I think deglobalization itself, as you said, I totally agree with you. I think globalization, why it was there or it is still there because it has benefits, and now now there's almost like a trend, anti-globalization or deglobalization. So what's going on? Is there anything we can do to somehow to continue this globalization, or we are certainly in the firm course of, in the reverse, basically deglobalization now?
Well, globalization, as I wrote in that article, was always sort of a nice word, but it lacked a theory. It speaks to the integration of the world economy through trade, through financial capital, through information flows, even through labor flows that arise through outsourcing. And clearly, the trade pieces receive the most attention as the growth of global trade has moved up sharply, and as China has played a very important role in driving that. I calculated in that article that no country has benefited more from the upswing of global trade and trade integration through associated with globalization than China. But now, as global trade slows, as supply chain tensions become politicized, then the process starts to run in reverse. And the country that benefited the most, China, stands quite possibly to lose the most as the trend goes the other way. And this puts the imperative on China to either develop new trading partners or, again, to focus much more on self-sufficiency and less reliance on trade as an engine of growth. It's a challenging development for China, and I think it's one that your government's leadership and strategists need to take very seriously, because I don't see the world rushing back to embrace open-ended globalization as it did in the early 2000s when China had just joined the World Trade Organization.
Mm-hmm. So if deglobalization certainly is here, inevitable, so what's its place of globalization, let's say, regionalization or regional trade agreement like that?
Well, I think regional trade is much more attractive, easier to manage, and it brings together nations that are not just geographically proximate to one another, but have some of the similar characteristics. So I think, we've seen that in North America, we've seen that in Asia, we've seen that through the European Union. Those are much easier models of economic and trade integration to handle. But these, big, global efforts, global trade liberalization, much more difficult to pull off, both politically, geostrategically, and when you have tensions like we're seeing with this horrific war in Europe, they really create major problems between alliances that make full-blown global integration a difficult thing to achieve.
Well, thank you, Steve. That's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to Ms. Roach again. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Chu Qian. See you next time.